afternoon. At times our own light goes out. So does my microphone. At times, is that on now?
Yeah.
Okay. At times our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lit the flame within us. These words by Henry David Thoreau. Why should we live in such a hurry and waste of life? We are determined to be starved before we are hungry. I wish to live deliberately, to confront only the essential facts. I wish to learn what life has to teach, and not, when I come to die, to discover that I have not lived. I do not wish to live what is not life. Living is so dear, nor do I wish to practice resignation except when it is quite necessary. I wish to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. I want to cut a broad swath, to drive into a corner, to reduce it to its lowest terms. If it proves to be mean, then to get the whole and the genuine meanness of it and publish its meanness to the world. Or, if it is sublime, to know it by experience and to be able to give a true account of it. "25 years ago, I know it seems long to some of you, Bob, when we purchased these hymnals, these gray hymnals that you will see in front of you, Bob spent an entire, maybe 1-2 Sundays mornings teaching us the hymns that are in, many of the hymns that are in this book. So in his memory today, we would like to have you participate with us in singing the Gedanken frei, which is number 291. It's in the gray hymnal. 291. This, I think, was his favorite. Please rise as you are able.
Gedanken sind frei, mein Gott bringt die Flower. Die Gedanken sind frei, mein Gott give me power. No scholar can map them, no hunter can trap them, no one can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. My thoughts are as free as wind o'er the ocean, and no one can see their form or their motion. No hunter can find them, no traveler find them. My lips may be still, but I think what I will. A glimmering fire, the darkness will brighten. My soaring desire, all troubles can lighten. No prison enfold me, its walls cannot hold me. No captive I'll be, for my spirit is free.
Please be seated. I can't tell you how great that sounds with this many wonderful voices. Could you hear Bob in that one? Jay? Okay, Jay is going to be doing a eulogy.
Thank you for being here today. Just before I received the news that my father had left the world, my sweetheart Alex and I were finishing a 1,000-piece puzzle. It was a painting of a cabin, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun, a giant autumn maple, the pines in the foreground, mountains in the hazy distance. All the distinctive parts were completed. It was down to 58 unplaced pieces, all the same color, with no pattern or markings on them, and 2 blank, kidney-sized holes in an otherwise stunning landscape. The puzzle sprawled over our table for days, the picture slowly materializing, except for those damn holes in the sky. And a moment before the news came, I loomed over those blank spots, picking through the unplaced pieces as though this was important. But then the call came, and nothing else in the world was important but the news about my father. My amazing father, Dr. Robert W. Olson, was a beautiful singer and scholar, a brilliant teacher and mentor, and a tireless punster. He spoke 6 languages and could pun in all of them, though I'm told his puns in Latin were a bit rusty. He traveled extensively and had a fond love of art, poetry, music, literature, and theater. He performed in and directed many operas over the course of his career, both as a tenor and a baritone. He also conducted. That's quite a range. When my brother and sister and I were little, he sang the role of the witch in Hansel and Gretel. My mom brought us backstage into the dressing room to see him before the performance. He swooped toward us, cackling in full makeup and costume. It was very effective. It took several days to convince me that he was not indeed the witch, disguised as my father. After all, my dad had a beard. This witch did not. So he endured several days of suspicious glares with humor and grace. Childhood with my dad was an adventure. It was full of magic. He called his children, all 3 of us, Lumpy, Gumpy, and Stumpy, and would play this horrible name game with us. Would you rather be called Cuthbert, Aloysius, Hassenpfeffer III, or Eustace Hildegard Snodgrass McGillicuddy? And then he would not give up until you chose. You had to choose. And then he would say, all right, Cuthbert, we'll call you Cuthbert from now on. He would let us ride on the hood of the car when we were driving on country roads. And he would let us steer on the way to Loon Lake. He would sneak us into the drive-in theater by stopping just before the entrance and let us crawl into the trunk. Later, I discovered that children get into the drive-in for free. So this was just to add a little bit more adventure to the process. At bedtime, he would read us Twain, Poe, Eliot, A.A. Milne, and Frank Baum, always beginning with the copyright and publishing information. MCMXXVI. It drove my sister crazy. He had a different voice for each character in the Winnie the Pooh stories. My favorite was his piglet falsetto. A huff huff, horrible heffalump, a hiffable huffalump, huff huff. Nothing beats it still. I remember fighting so hard to stay awake to listen to his melodious voice just a little longer. What a wonderful sound to fall asleep to. It seemed to me that my dad approached music like a scientist as well as an artist. He knew as much about anatomy as he did about art song. and as much about art song as he did about opera. But there was some third element in his approach that I could never articulate. Heart, I guess, maybe. When we were kids, he loved to play ragtime piano for us. He also played and sang Christmas carols all year long, and he would often change the lyrics, and he played them all in minor key. Except for We Three Kings, which he played in major, giving it an uncharacteristically jovial sound. For years, I thought the carols played on the radio sounded so saccharine. Just long. They were off. I was an adult before I figured out what had happened, and that I was the recipient of an extremely lengthy practical joke. My dad was a delighted prankster. He had a very sharp wit, a wonderful sense of humor, a quick temper, and a driving need to right any injustice. He was very impatient with technology and poorly designed equipment, but he had an endless well of patience for people. He was very kind, loving, and very principled. Social justice was a driving force in his life, long before it was fashionable. He was politically active and active in his community. He donated his time, money, and resources to the ACLU, the National Organization of Women, and dozens of other organizations working to make the world a better, more equal, and just place. But he donated far more of his time and resources to supporting individuals. He always gave of himself 100% to everything, and not because he felt obligated, not to gain recognition, but because it was natural to him. It was like breathing for him. If you were lonely, he'd come and get you. He'd take you to lunch or for a walk by the river. He was the guy who would visit your bedside with an armload full of articles, puzzles, games, and jokes, and would sit with you hour upon hour to tell you stories and news long after other friends and relations had stopped coming to your sickbed. He always seemed to appear in times of trouble, to shoulder you without judgment or expectation. He didn't have to know you very well to do these things. I can't count the number of people I've heard say, if it wasn't for your father, I would never have made it through. He was a fast-moving, busy man, but he made a habit of slowing down to spend time with people. Dad was a prolific letter writer. He sent letters to scores of acquaintances, friends, and relations via snail mail, in addition to his regular emails. He mailed cards for every birthday, anniversary, wedding, graduation, birth, and loss of a loved one. He made thousands of phone calls to those in need of a little encouragement, a little love and support. We are just now finding out the extent to which he worked in the service of others, because of all the stories, the calls, the Facebook postings, and we're finding articles about his accomplishments, many of which we knew nothing about. My dad worked hard his whole life at everything he did. Every summer through high school, he worked and saved, never spending a penny, so that in 1950, at the age of 17, he could buy a beautiful grand piano from the 1880s. Many of you remember the piano from your voice lessons. He played it every day for 66 years before donating it to the Unitarian Church. There it is. It's not enough to say that he was a brilliant student. He learned to read and write Latin in grade school. He devoured the entire complete works of Shakespeare by the age of 12. When he developed an interest in meditation, he began teaching himself Sanskrit, hoping to read the Vedas in their original language. He caught the attention of a teacher named Brusaw in Superior while he was still in high school. Brusaw was a mentor to my dad and told him that if he was serious about music, he had to go to Vienna. That planted a seed in his head. He continued singing and enrolled at the local college, but after one particularly harsh winter in Superior, Wisconsin, he said, "That's it," and enrolled at the University of Arizona in Tucson. My mother and father were married in Tucson before he completed his BA and MA there. His MA was almost a master's in chemistry. He really labored over that decision. It was difficult for him, but he chose music. Dad dearly loved Tucson and returned many times over the next 5 decades. Between his master's and doctorate, he joined the Air Force, working as a courier, traveling with top secret documents all over the country. After that, he began his doctoral program in voice at the University of Champaign-Urbana. He and my mother moved to Vienna in 1962, where he studied voice with Ferdinand Grossmann, the director of the Vienna Boys Choir, and attended the Conservatory of Music in Vienna. Over the next 2 years, he was guest adult soloist with the Vienna Boys Choir twice, this young man from Superior, Wisconsin. The family moved to Bergen, Norway in 1965, where my dad taught voice at the Teachers College. During his years in Europe, he traveled extensively, and he loved it. He was a dynamo in a new city. He could cover more ground in a single day than most people in 2 or 3. He was tireless, full of wonder at the world around him. Robert Olson not only had character, he was a character. He possessed a fearless fashion sense. You know what I'm talking about. As a teen, he smoked cigars and wore a fedora. He carefully maintained a few pair of wingtips and shining black dress shoes so that they last him 40 to 50 years. But he really came into his own with his 4th of July specials. Red, white, and blue striped leather shoes, worn every year on the day with star-spangled socks. And in order to really showcase them, a pair of 3/4 length shorts. It takes a lot of personality to pull off a look like that, but my dad did it. When he began teaching at NDSU in 1967, he soon learned that professors were expected to wear neckties and suit coats. And since no Olson ever did anything that they didn't damn well want to, he exercised free will where he could. He made collecting the most hideous ties in all of creation his holy mission. He acquired hundreds over the years. Then, just in case he was tempted to coordinate with his suit coat, he would call one of his kids into the room in the morning to choose the tie. Oh, I loved choosing the tie. I usually opted for the purple, orange, and green tie with the cartoon lions and tigers floating in space. It was very wide. That one especially popped if he was wearing a plaid blazer that day. To a 4-year-old, this man was the most fantastic dresser imaginable. When the time came, he had difficulty retiring. It took him 7 attempts. Finally, he succeeded, but even then, he continued teaching private lessons for years until he donated his piano. My dad was beloved by his students, many of whom kept in touch with him through their own retirement from teaching and singing. I always loved meeting them, hearing stories about my dad through someone else's eyes, from someone else's perspective. It's so delightful to see people sparkle with admiration for him. He loved teaching, and he went far above and beyond to help and support his students. He was devoted to them. I wonder if he ever really knew how much effect he had on people, his students, his friends, his colleagues. I doubt it. I know for sure his students have no idea how much they enriched his life. To all of you former students out there, please know that you filled him with joy and purpose, and he never stopped talking about you, not to the very end. I thank you for that, bringing so much happiness to him. You are his legacy. I won't pretend that my dad was perfect. Our family had some pretty rough years. We all said and did things we regret, but no matter what happened, he stuck by us. I know we put him through the ringer in our teen years, but he rarely so much as raised his voice. The love and dedication he's shown his grandkids is unimaginable. In the end, he was a loving, enduring supporter, father, grandfather, and friend. I know many of you understand what I mean. These are some pieces, just some pieces of my father's life. There are so many of them. He lived 85 years, more than most. I know we were lucky to have him this long, but still, I'm not ready to give him up. My last visit with my dad was in late November, but it was one of the best I've had. I got so much time with him, just the two of us. We talked for hours. We looked through photographs. We walked in the sunshine, played music. I got to tell him how much I loved him. I got to tell him how much I think of him. But I didn't get my spring visit. I spoke to him 3 days before he passed, but it wasn't enough. I knew this day would come, probably soon, possibly without that one last perfect goodbye. And still, with all of those pieces in place, the puzzle is not finished. I'm standing at the end of his life, holding up oddly shaped pieces, like questions, trying to place them. Scrambling for a more complete picture, a completion so few of us ever get. I need just a little more time, one more call, 10 more words, 100 more questions, one more spring. While I regret not visiting sooner, not calling him on Thursday night, I'm grateful for the time we had. It was a blessing. It's just that there is no perfect time, no good time to lose someone so dear. There is no perfect last phone call, no perfect last hug or final I love you. Nearly everyone lost in the history of time leaves an unfinished puzzle with holes that will never be filled in. So, Alex and I have decided that we aren't going to finish our puzzle at home. We're going to try to accept that one more day, one more visit, one more year, even one more lifetime would not be enough time with my dad. We'd still feel there were holes in the sky and that the landscape was incomplete. So, if you are struggling with this loss, having run out of time while life was happening around you, feeling like you should have called or written sooner, that you didn't have the chance to say the perfect goodbye, know that you were in good company. Please feel free to pocket one of the puzzle pieces, one of the 58 that I brought with me today. Carry it with you until the edges are frayed, the shining surface worn dull. Carry it until it morphs into a piece that no longer fits its original puzzle. Until all that is left is the memory of a friendship with a beautiful man who built a beautiful life, lovingly pieced together from each of you. Until we forget about the missing pieces and see only the beautiful landscape. I will miss you, Dad, so terribly. I love you. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you for loving my dad too.
learned already, Bob truly enjoyed poetry. And Mary Oliver was one of his favorite poets. So this poem is by Mary Oliver. It's titled, I Looked Up. I looked up, and there it was, among the green branches of the pitch pines, thick bird, a ruffle of fire trailing over the shoulders and down the back. Color of copper, iron, bronze, lighting up the dark branches of the pine. What misery to be afraid of death. What wretchedness to be only in what can be proven. When I made a little sound, it looked at me. Then it looked past me. Then it rose, the wings enormous and opulent, and, as I said, breathed in fire. Now, Marty, would you like to give some reflections? And then following this, we will have time for some community memories.
Mic check. There we go. Jay, what a just. Today I wear a sweatshirt I used to wear when I went to voice lessons. Shakespeare, 12th night. If music be the food of life, play on, play on, play on. Well, Doc and I liked food, and he was a loving man. We used to go after lessons, as all of you know, and you've probably done it. You go to the King House, we'd have food. And people would join us, and then we'd talk. I always, when I was younger and I was studying theater, I always thought it would be great to live during the 30s, the Bohemian period, when all the greats got together and talked about literature. And we had that. We would talk for an hour and a half, consciousness, tried to stay away from religion and sports, got into talking about what was happening in the world, very little about politics, but talk about singers, about a new song, about maybe Bach or maybe some of the Schubert songs. And we'd talk about our lives, and you'd walk out just filled with joy. You just walk down the street going, I'm alive. I first met Doc in 1973 when I came to start my master's work at NDSU. And they needed someone to help direct an opera, one of the stage operas for the shorts. Gallantry, I think it was. And I went over and met him. Well, as you mentioned, two punsters coming together is bad news. He was great, and I loved it. But Shakespeare loved it. So I started working with him. He said, I can't pay you anything, but I'll give you voice lessons. And I was thrilled, because I was a trumpet player that had spent 21 years playing first chair and playing in ensembles, and I was tight. And I always wanted to sing. I always wanted to have a little bit of Lanza in me. Well, it took him a long time to get rid of that tension and the fear. Most of us don't like to say anything or sing because we have to fear people to hear who we are and what we're about. But Doc took the fear away from you. His pedagogy, his techniques. I mean, for weeks you'd be twiddling all the way down. And you go, what's going on? And then all of a sudden it break open. I remember I was singing Eva Lachella from Tosca, and Pat was playing. He stopped, he stood over by the piano for about a minute and a half, and I said, wow, I thought I was really cooking. He said, I'd like to have you as a student 30 years ago. So I knew that I'd arrived. But the other thing is that he then started to train me in his pedagogy. He said, I don't want you to be a smart, jazzy guy out there teaching belt voice. I want you to teach what I know. So he started introducing me to all the philosophies and techniques. And it's made all the difference. I teach that way. But when I went to the internet and placed his notice, 58 people from all over the United States, all saying, thank you for mentoring me. Thank you for sharing with me. Thank you for making me allowed to teach as you do. And all of this. I mean, Janet from Broadway, Janet Dickinson, Tim Homley from Minneapolis singing in a cabaret group. Greg Lorenz sings with the opera in New York and teaches. Paul Kelly, my brother-in-law, sings with a very fine barbershop quartet in Omaha. I mean, look at the strength of this. And we used to always talk about, well, are we doing anything? And he wouldn't brag. We had the comment like Walter Brennan used to say, no brag, just fact. But he would tell about his exposés, and he would talk about people, and he'd always say, well, do we touch anybody? Do we arrive? And I said, if you touch one, you touch 1,000. They're out there. You're here. We're all part of it. At grand piano is here. Bob's with us. And as we walk the path of life, he will always walk with me. We will go so far on that path, and then people will leave, people will join, someone gets separated, but they come back. And he had this way of going for walks and talking and mentoring and sharing. So Bob is the statement. Music will go on and on and on. Thank you, Robert.
And now, all of us, I know, just are burning to share a Bob story. And we do have two gentlemen in the back, Elman and Mark, and they each have a microphone. So I invite you to simply raise your hand. They'll bring a microphone to you, and then you may share your story with all of us, because I know we would like to hear some Bob stories. However, my one caveat is, when using the microphone, please hold it right very close to your mouth so we can all hear. So raise your hand if you have a story you would like to share.
Good afternoon. My name is Donald Kress. I knew Bob for many years, largely through my father, Warren Kress. Bob and my dad were colleagues and friends at North Dakota State University, so you may remember my dad. I was not a student. Those of you who know me know that my musical talent is extremely limited. But I made up for it by working in technical theater, and in later life I worked with Bob on the Tri-College Operas and at NDSU and NDSU Festival Concert Hall, working on some of the projects Marty and Bob worked on together there. And Bob was always a very good friend. My father was terminally ill. He had Lou Gehrig's disease, and Bob was always very supportive and visited me, visited Dad, always with that positive view, always with that that positive outlook, always supportive, very supportive, and Bob was gracious enough to be the soloist at my dad's funeral. Now, let's think about this for a second, as our folks have done here, Mr. Christensen and the two ladies here. They got up and performed and sat down. But of course, when you're a professor of music and you've got an audience, you can't resist a little lecture about the song you're going to sing. So there was a brief lecture about golden days in the opera The Student Prince, which preceded Bob's performance. And he sang a fine song, and so I greatly appreciated that. I was looking forward to seeing Bob this spring through our friend Marty Jonas, and I mainly queue up through Bob and through Marty, who I've known for 35 years or so. But the thing that Bob would leave with me is qualities I wish I could emulate as well as he did. Always be enthusiastic, always be vigorous, always be unhesitatingly on to the next project. Never be afraid to never be afraid to try something new. Always keep going. That's Bob to me. Thank you.
First one's always the hardest.
Don't be shy.
I met Dr. Olson. He'll always be Doc. Never going to count the Bob part. As a brash, arrogant theater major at NDSU who knew I needed voice lessons. So I went over to the music building, and I said, somebody suggested him, or I found him. And I, of course, as a theater major, was a smoker and a belter, and he didn't judge. Come on in. He took me as I was, taught me whatever I wanted to learn. What a man. Oh, Jay, what a eulogy you gave him. I'm sorry, this is awful. I thought I could do better. Anyway, never judged me for not practicing, for smoking, for belching. You know, he never did. And I went away, got married. He sang for my wedding. He got up and sang Some Enchanted Evening, bless his heart, and Make Our Garden Grow, because it's what I wanted. And then I went back to voice lessons. But always when I called him, he would answer the phone. I'd say, Doc, this is Nicole. And he said, Nicole. My whole life I became Nicole. I was never anything else. Nicole. And he welcomed me back at any time, on any day for a lesson. Hardly charged me anything because his just was such a great heart. And through the years, he and Don and I then would go to lunch to sort of rekindle our friendship long after I was done taking voice lessons. And my favorite thing, I'm, first of all, thrilled to see all these people I know that knew him, but I didn't know knew him. This is great. My favorite thing was that we would get to politics, and it was the best. He was so disgusted with the world. Just could listen to him forever. So thank you, Doc, for everything, and for all of you.
I'm Don LaRue. I taught in the theater department for many years, can't even hold a mic. I know Bob to be a passionate person. He wanted the students to have additional performance experiences, and he was very adamant about having an opera workshop. And there was no money for it. In those days, there wasn't money. So he did it on a shoestring, and I think most of the time he paid for the shoestring. So I worked with him really through time. I think the earliest thing I did was a production we did over at the old concert hall, Illuminati, and I did sets and costumes in terms of for that. And I thought, we need to do this. So what did he do? He helped me with doing voice and performance kinds of things for the theater folks. And we did the first, he wanted to do the Beggar's Opera, John Gay's Beggar's Opera. And he didn't have enough kids to do it. So I said, well, let me talk to the theater kids. And we got enough people together to do that show. And it was the first performance done in the new Festival Concert Hall. It was the very first thing, first performance before anything else really was happening there. Shirley was a part of that, and Shirley's a part of that experience. And we also then, I think we did one of the early performances of Manatti's The Medium, Darcy, that's how I got to know Darcy, in the festival concert, in the recital hall, which is a really limited space, but again, we dealt with theater kids as well as the music kids in order to be able to pull it off. My life would have been a lot different had I not known Bob. And I felt grateful for the opportunity of having that shared experience, because I could see with those young people that had that opera experience, when it came to recital time, they were much better performers than they were if they'd not had that experience. And I would say, just like Brandy said, we miss in terms of not having lunch with Bob. He'd just call up, he'd usually be just finishing his job over at the library, at the bookstore, and he'd say, well, let's go to lunch with things. So we miss that in terms of Bob. Thank you.
I'm Maureen Kelly Jonason, and I've known Bob since the 70s. My older brother Paul was a tenor in the music department, and Dr. Fissinger had told him it's theater or it's music, you don't get both. And so he chose music, which took him to Europe and all kinds of places. But I still remember the opera workshop, the little operas, and the fun, odd little operas that they would do. And there's one, you'll have to help me with the title, where the devil, I think he gets married, and then pretty soon he brings the wife back because she's so mean to him, and the devil can't even stand her. But I just remember my brother being dressed up in a red costume with horns, and his tail has a bandage on it, and he's going down the aisle of Festival Hall, if you remember how long it is, and he's being beaten by this woman as she's coming behind him. And it just is a lot. I was probably 11 or 12 years old at the time, and it was great fun to see him do that. But he went away and did other things, and he's in the military, and but every time he came back, they wouldn't even say hello. It was, what time? When are you available? And they would just automatically set up a lesson. That was the known thing between them was, we're going to have a lesson. And I was thinking of it earlier today, and I was thinking, Doc wanted to know, what have you been doing with this treasure? Have you been guarding your treasure? Have you been working with it? You know, what do you sound like now? And it was always very gratifying for Paul to get a chance to visit with Doc. So thank you, Doc.
I have to share this story for my mother, who couldn't make it here today, and it's very nice to meet you all. My name is Sarah. I met Robert Olson when I was in 9th grade. At that time, I was singing in a lot of children's theater and received the news that I had nodules, which was drastic at that time. And my mom worked very hard to try and find options, and that's when we came across the Voice Institute. And we've told this story in our family 1,000 times, because my mother is the most conservative type A personality person you will ever meet. And we drove up to his home one afternoon for my first voice lessons. And we weren't sure if it was the right house, because it was like a home. And it was a little more, I mean, it wasn't what you would expect, thinking, we're going to the Voice Institute, and here's his home, and we're sitting in the driveway, both her and I are very nervous to enter the home, when a guy comes to the window and he's naked. And we're like, this can't be the house. So we look at the address, and we look at the home, and I'm like, Mom, this has to be it. And I don't know where my mom got the courage to go up to the front door, because it's unlike anything she's ever done in her life. Turns out the man inside was wearing a tan tank top He was clothed, so that was good. Very nice. But he came to transform our entire lives. His attitude saved my parents' marriage. His teaching saved my voice. There was one other thing that I'll never forget. He had a picture on the wall that was a cartoon that I'm told that his son drew that he was very, very proud of. And are you the son? Wow. So on one side of this cartoon was a man meditating, and it went Om. And then on the other side of the page was a cow, and it went moo. And 23 years later, I'm still a yoga teacher, so thank you for that.
I'm Mary Wallum, and for many years I was in the English department at NDSU. And so I knew Bob primarily as a colleague and not through singing or any of his teaching. But the last time I saw him was at Pat O'Connor's funeral. And Pat O'Connor and Bob and I had a number of those famous lunches. And they would go on for a long time, and we would talk, yes, what everyone said about everything. But we also served together on the committee for the building of the Reineke Fine Arts Center. And I remember working with Bob to make sure that people kept acoustics at the very top. And after graduation, the year that the Fine Arts Center was being built, it was nearing completion, and Bob invited me to go over to the concert hall. And we went up in the balcony, and he gave a demo of what that hall was going to sound like. It was wonderful.
Hello, my name is David Silbergleit. I met Dr. Olson in 1982, and we became friends, and then very strong friends. I don't have much to say, but I could use a few words that make me think of him. He was a man who had quality. He had kindness, compassion, and a sense of fairness, such as one rarely sees. I believe he was a genius. We'd go out to lunch very often. We had a lot to talk about, and he knew a lot. One day at lunch, there was a newspaper on the table. We were eating, and he picked it up. And I thought, uh-oh, I'm going to be with a fellow who's just going to read the newspaper. Well, he didn't miss a beat. He picked up a pencil, and we talked completely clearly. He was not distracted, and we finished eating, and then I wondered what he was scribbling about, and he showed it to me. He had done a crossword puzzle without batting an eye, without missing a beat. I'm slow, Bob was fast. We took long walks together and often, and they were always a pleasure. Bob was a little irritated that I walked slowly, but he never said much, but I knew I better pick up my pace. A few years ago, I got a serious back injury, and I could barely walk. But Bob would say, let's go for a walk. We'd go for a walk, and I thought, uh-oh, this is not going to play well. Well, Bob, impatient as I thought he was, had the kindest patience and understanding and compassion. and they said, there's a man with heart and soul. Professor Olson was a wonderful, wonderful man. There aren't many like him.
Dr. Olson, I was lucky enough to have him as my voice teacher, as a very young singer, a very average singer at the time. And, well, I mean, and now I'm really good. But what Randy said was so true. Many of us were sort of average singers, but after you spent a little time in his studio, you never felt that way. You always felt like there was nothing that you couldn't accomplish, because he believed in you, and he was never impatient, even with the little that we knew and understood. He just took the time to make you, help you understand, and you just couldn't wait to get into your lesson. And I mean, I didn't think I was going to be the first one to say it, but I think there's several of us in the room that could say it. So should we say it together? Knock on the door, and we would hear, "Come in." Always the same thing. Come in. But when I started teaching at NDSU, he was still teaching in the studio next door. And you know, it's kind of scary to start to go back to your alma mater, and most of the faculty that was there when you were in undergrad were still there. And I was a little concerned about, now how am I going to fit in as a faculty member with my teachers who are still here. And he was the one who insisted that I call him Bob. That was tough. I most of the time didn't, but no, it's Bob, it's Bob. But also, when he decided to retire, that we were left with a little bit of a hole in terms of the number of faculty that we had, and I ended up having to teach some voice students. And I've not done studio teaching much, and because I'm a choral director, and I really had very little confidence in my ability, and so I said, yeah, Bob, I don't know how I'm going to be able to do this, and he said, well, you know, for the young student, you know enough for the young students to really help them, and for those great students, you're not going to hurt them. I mean, he said it very matter-of-factly, and I mean, he wasn't, but that's the thing, is that you could trust him to tell you what was true. And I was never going to be a good voice teacher, but I wasn't going to do much harm. And actually, that was enough. That gave me the confidence, because I knew that he knew me, and he knew that that was the truth, that I wasn't going to do any harm. And so I was able to teach those students with a lot more confidence. I think he gave all of us confidence to be who we were, and to know that who we were was enough.
Good afternoon. Rick Casper, a student of Dr. Olson's. I was an accounting major at MSUM late 70s, and I ended up, just for fun, joining the show choir there. That led to recognition, occasionally a solo here and there, to which led to, you need to go see Dr. Olson over at NDSU, he's the best. Well, there was a fair amount of structure at that time in the music department at MSUM. Things were kind of organized, and Reinecke, as mentioned earlier, was brand new at that time. So I walk into Reinecke, and I walk to Dr. Olson's office, and I open the door, and he was there at the piano after the come in, but the room was pretty much full of music and papers and crossword puzzles, and there was kind of that piano was there somewhere. But he began the hour voice lesson with 20 minutes of discussion. And I must have, when Jay mentioned, he was wearing a tie back then, and for about 5 minutes, I was thinking to myself, should I say something about that thing? Being an accounting major, seeing that thing that he had on so I chose not to. So the first 20 minutes was discussion, and it was discovered that my dad had the bookstore at NDSU at that time, and he was there for 39 years. So that led to, why are books so highly priced? What's your opinion? And so I'm now thinking, okay, we've got about a half of an hour left. Are we going to get it at some point to singing? And what he was really doing is getting to understand my voice, and then we started to work, and then the phone would ring, and on about ring 6, he would pick up the phone, and in that same voice as when the door would open, he always was in voice whenever he was using his voice. But the last thought was, I ended up, Marty mentioned Janet Dickinson and Tim Homley and others, had the good fortune of doing studio work and some live jazz and things here. Took my craft to Los Angeles in '85, and with me went a cassette of Dr. Olson's voice lesson. And whenever there was a need to get the voice back on track, that cassette was in my car or in my apartment. And you know, there were the singers for the stars, and there were all the big shots in LA that were not bashful about charging too much money for their craft. But when it came down to it, it was that tape from Dr. Robert Olson. Until I finally wore it out, that was my stronghold for getting my voice in shape. My family and I, we moved back here in 1999. And one of the first calls was to Dr. Olson to say, we need to get things back in shape. So I don't sing anywhere near as much as I used to, but there he was, fully dressed at that house in North Fargo. But a wonderful, very intelligent, gifted man, and very proud to have known him and his talents. Thank you.
Well, I'm David Olson, and I'll share a little different story about growing up with him. He was my uncle, and Uncle Bob would stop by whenever he could. He would stop by and visit us at our house down in Woodbury in the Twin Cities, and the whole normal life would just stop. We'd all pile around the coffee table or on the kitchen table, and the pots of coffee would just start flowing. We never short. It would be hours we would be sitting there, and sometimes Grandpa would be there with in my earlier days, and the stories and the conversations, and like every 10 minutes they were up making another pot of coffee. And still, the last time I met him, it was over a cup of coffee, and I'll look forward to meeting him in another world with a cup of coffee and for another long conversation.
I didn't know Bob as a musician or singer, but a friend, David had introduced me to him about 20-something years ago now, about 22 years ago. And I remember us, I told somebody this earlier, I was just newly divorced at the time. I was just on my own again, and David Silverglide here and Bob, they said, well, you know, we went to a movie. We went to a movie together, and we said, there's a Mel Gibson movie. Let's go see that. So we go over there, and we actually took the wrong turn and wound up in the movie Contact, I remember. And we thought it was a preview when we were sitting there, and then David looks at me and says, no, Greg, this is a movie. But we ended up watching it, so we stayed and watched that. And I remember Bob saying, "Well, it was a good yarn," and I said, "Yeah, it was very good." And but anyway, my wife and we were talking. How many did he have lunch with him at King House? He really liked the King House. He really got into that. So, and he didn't sing at our wedding. My wife here Kathy, he sang at he spoke, because he had that rich voice, and we needed somebody for a reading, and called him up, and he was there to do it. He was great, and he's missed. So that's all I have.
Hi everyone. I'm Bob Jr. I'm the middle child. I'm not supposed to be speaking, especially after my little sister knocked it out of the park. Thank you for coming here and honoring my father. If you meet me or my son afterwards, you may be drooling and red in the eyes because we both had gigs last night. Neither of us really studied music with my father, which was a terrible loss, as most of you know. But what he did teach us both was about being human. And his musical chops aside, he knew more about that than anyone I've ever met. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Martha Olson, and I was always honored that I had the same name as Dr. Olson's mother. He shared the beautiful picture with me. I met Dr. Olson when I was a graduate student at NDSU. I came here in 1975, and I studied with him while I was getting my master's degree, and then moved away and came back and I had a very bad cough, and I kind of thought the old voice was gone. It happened to my mother, and I was a little bit afraid that that was going to happen to me. And I was in a play at the community theater, and I thought Dr. Olson had retired and gone away to Arizona or someplace, and he showed up after the show. He'd come back to town, and he had started his vocal rehab business, and I loved my lessons with him when I studied with him in college, and so I reconnected with him and realized that I just needed to get reconditioned. Didn't have anything structurally wrong with my voice, and I could sing again. And as it turned out, I realized that some of my best singing years were ahead of me rather than behind me, and I was very grateful for that. I would like to say something to the kids, Dr. Olson's children. Those of us who took lessons from Dr. Olson, it was more than just that hour lesson. It was, maybe an hour and a half or another hour after a conversation, and we talked about a lot of things. But since the time I studied with him in college and all through the next 7 to 10 years that I worked with him after we reconnected, he always talked about you kids. He was very proud of you and the grandkids and your accomplishments, and he shared those things with those of us. So when you thank us for what we gave to him, I'd like to let you know he also shared you with us, and we appreciated that familiar touch, his willingness to be open and sharing about the things that he loved the most, which I think were music and art and literature, but not more than his beautiful, wonderful children. I used to sing in a choral group that was connected by Dr. Miller here, and I remember at one of our concerts, we were, I don't know if you remember this, but we were just kind of chit-chatting, and we noticed amongst the singers, who were also teachers in the community, how many, and people who came, and Dr. Olson could come to our concerts, how many people around this organization, either as patrons or participants, had been touched by Dr. Olson and the things that he taught us as singers were passed on from one student to the next. I'm not a singer, but I've certainly recommended singers to him. I mean, I'm not a teacher, but certainly recommended singers to him, and have known many in this community who, they're choral conductors, and when they use the same warm-ups that we all learned from Dr. Olson. And I've seen John Miller's students teach us the same warm-ups and the same techniques that were taught by Dr. Olson. That's the beauty of being an educator, and Dr. Olson was one of the best, and that legacy just continues to go on and on. So whether or not you believe in life after death, some of us do, some of us don't, but certainly there's life after life, and his legacy will continue in many ways for many, many years to come. And I feel honored to have known him and considered him my friend, and that he helped me be the best singer I could ever be. And if I had worked harder, I would have been even better. But as has been said, he took us where we were, and he took us where we were willing to go. And if we showed the initiative to go deeper and stronger and bigger and better, he'd take us there. When I was in college, I wanted to do a recital, but because I was graduating, I didn't have the time. So I was able to come back and do a couple of recitals when I was working with him later in my life, and he took that effort on my part as seriously as anything, and I'm sure as any student he had. He wanted me to have a successful experience as a singer and to do the very best that I could, and he was engaged in it 100%, and that made all the difference. It made a better performer out of me, and it made my offering to my little audience better than it would have been otherwise, and I'm so grateful. Thank you.
I would like to close the sharing part of it with some of Bob's life here at the church. As we mentioned before, he became a member in 1971 until he sold his house and moved to Duluth in preparation of moving down to Minneapolis. Bob touched the lives of many people here at the church in his music, the piano, but he also was very willing to sing whenever we needed someone to sing. I know of two people who said when they knew in advance that Bob was going to do a solo, they made sure they came. And so we much appreciated his musical offerings here. He also was on the board, I believe, and he took leadership roles. He helped with some entertainment venues over the years, pledge drives and stuff like that, and it was always fun to get him involved in the drama as well. And toward the later years, he and I had many conversations about what to do with his house. He was extremely stressed over his house and all of the stuff that he knew he had in there that he knew he had to get rid of. And he kept talking about his music and where to donate it and who wants this. And I think he finally gave up and just put it all in big boxes and took it over to NDSU and put it on somebody's desk and said, here. He just didn't, he knew he couldn't move it. It was just too much. And he was very frustrated over that move. And he and I had many talks about that. So we not only miss him as a church community, I miss him as an individual. He was very special. Okay, Darcy.
Feel
thank you all who participated in the musical part as well as the verbal part of this service. It was very, very special. Your program cover had one addition that was inadvertently left off. Allison Brennan here played the flute solo at the very beginning of Prelude. Please join the family downstairs for refreshments. There's lots of refreshments, including herring, which I know Bob, every time he had to bring food here, he'd always bring herring and bread. So we have some of that downstairs too. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Because of those who came before, we are. In spite of their failings, we believe. Because of and in spite of the horizons of their visions, we too dream. Let us go remembering to praise, to live in the moment, to love mightily, and to bow to the mystery. Please join us as we sing a recessional, Go Now in Peace. It's number 413 in the blue hymnal. 413. Please stand if you are able to sing this twice.
Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the light of God surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the light of God surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go.
Please join us downstairs.
How are you? Let's eat! We're gonna try and move things downstairs.
About that guy. Good hair. So I guess I was
Well,